Welcome to Dominion Book Recommendations for Pastors. In this segment, I want to provide a short list of books that I believe every pastor should read in order to get a better grasp on economic issues and wealth generation and accumulation principles. This list is made up of books I've read and found incredibly profitable. Furthermore, they are extremely readable. In other words, I'm recommending books that I don't think will bog you down in technical analysis or deal only with uninteresting theoretical situations. For me, they were enjoyable to read, and I think that's important because a book doesn't have to be dull, uninspiring, and lacking joy to be intellectually stimulating, informative, and educational. Also, importantly, the authors don't mistake complex mathematical formulations for economic reality. Now, like always, I'm not going to provide any in-depth review of the books I recommend, as I usually do that in writing or provide links to what I believe to be excellent reviews by others. So, with that noted, here are my 5 books that every pastor should read on economics. Starting off at number 1 is The Good of Affluence, Seeking God in a Culture of Wealth by John R. Schneider. With a well-organized attack on wealth creators and accumulators continuing to heat up in both the political and the ecclesiastical arenas, I think it's important for pastors to get a solid grasp on the positive biblical view of wealth and its use. Now, I'm leading off with this book because I think it's important enough that if you don't read anything else concerning economics or wealth creation and use and accumulation, this would be the must-read. The Good of Affluence is a powerful 220-page antidote to the soft socialism that passes as Christian economic thought in seminaries and Christian colleges today. Number 2 is Productive Christians in an Age of Guilt Manipulators, a Biblical Response to Ronald J. Sider. It's by David Chilton. As indicated in the title, this is Chilton's outstanding response to Sider's influential book, Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger. Without impugning Sider's motivations for his teachings, the fact remains that he takes most of his scriptural reference out of context and dramatically misrepresents the meaning. Unfortunately, it may have been one of the most harmful books published in the 70s and early 80s, as it wrapped extreme left-wing socialist economic theory in the clothing of Christian concerns. It's also unfortunate that Sider continues to hold a place of esteem even among conservative seminary professors and students to this day. Productive Christians in an Age of Guilt Manipulators effectively destroys Sider's arguments from a solid Christian biblical worldview. The book runs a little over 400 pages, but it's one of the fastest 400-page reads you'll find. Chilton's book has its weaknesses, especially in dealing with property and jubilee laws. But don't worry, John Schneider cleans up and clarifies these issues in The Good of Affluence, which is why I made that book number 1. The Wealth and Poverty of Nations is my 3rd recommendation. It continues on with Why Some Are So Rich and Some Are So Poor. It is written by David Landis from Harvard University. I love this book. I want to give you a heads up right away by pointing out that this is the longest book I'm recommending, and at 650 pages, it could be intimidating. However, this is an incredibly well-written book that you'll find hard to put down. I know some of you may think that I need to get a life when I tell you that a book on economics is thick enough to be a doorstop makes me giddy, but The Wealth and Poverty of Nations is that good. So good that I'm sorry I'm placing it at number 3 on the list. Landis' chapter on clocks and how Christian thinking about time revolutionized the West and unleashed individual and corporate productivity is marvelous, and it's worth the entire price of the book alone. Landis is a professor of history at Harvard, and the book is not Christian in the sense that it was written from a self-conscious Christian view. But God's truth is beautiful no matter who unveils it, and Landis does indeed. I want to read one paragraph of an Amazon.com review that you can take it from there. While some countries were able to industrialize and others weren't, has been the subject of much heated debate over the decades. Climate, natural resources, and geography have all been put forward as explanations, and all are brushed aside by Landis in favor of his own controversial history. That the ability to effect an industrial revolution is dependent on certain cultural traits, without which industrialization is impossible to sustain. Landis contrasts the characteristics of successful industrialized nations, work, thrift, honesty, patience, and tenacity, with those of non-industrial countries, arguing that until these values are internalized by all nations, the gulf between the rich and poor will continue to grow. I would recommend that you buy and read The Wealth and Poverty of Nations. The 4th book on my list is The Mystery of Capital, Why Capitalism Triumphs in the West and Fails Everywhere Else by Hernando de Soto. This book makes the case for laws defining and protecting property rights as well as any book that I've ever read. His research and presentation on how clearly titled private property is foundational to wealth building and accumulation is outstanding. Also, De Soto clearly demonstrates the superiority of a Christian biblical view of God's laws as he points out that unless you have a culture of honesty and integrity backed up by strong enforcement of contract law, and I guess you could say here that a version of trust but verify takes place, capital markets cannot exist. I wrote a review of De Soto's book several years ago. A friend of mine who knows him sent De Soto my review and told me after the fact. Frankly, I was a little apprehensive because it seemed a little presumptive that a pastor of a church would write a published review of a renowned economic thinker. And he's a devout Catholic man, I might add. However, I was blessed when he sent me a very encouraging note telling me I had indeed got his book right. The Mystery of Capital is an important and powerful book every pastor should read. Fifth and finally, I recommend The Millionaire Next Door by Thomas J. Stanley. With all the attacks on wealth creators and accumulators, it's important and vital to understand who these people are. And Stanley does a marvelous job of providing a portrait of the rich, and they're not the evil people President Obama, Senator Elizabeth Warren, author Thomas Piketty, or even Pope Francis sets forth. This is not to say that every rich person is a saint, but simply to say that they're more likely to simply be the person next door, the millionaire next door, you could say, which means that they're hardworking, own a small business that provides needed jobs in the community, value marriage and family, learn the discipline of savings, takes calculated risks to create businesses, invest in productive and wealth-creating companies, and are more likely to live in an upper middle-class neighborhood as opposed to a gated community. They drive a Ford 150 rather than a Mercedes. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I wish I could afford a Mercedes S-Class sedan. I recommend The Millionaire Next Door because in essence it is a tangible reality of the book of Proverbs come alive. Read it to be reminded on how a Christian worldview creates culture and possibility for wealth creation and accumulation.